knew him when I first met him. He's a public intellectual, theologian, pastor, civic political activist from Uganda. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Religion, Faith and Culture in Public Life, a non-denominational, non-partisan platform to engage in study, discourse on faith, religion, and culture on the African continent. He has spoken and taught in Uganda, Kenya, other parts of Africa, and around the world. Years back, he took an early retirement from serving as an assistant bishop in the Church of Uganda to serve the cause of social justice and good governance in Uganda, and by extension to other parts of Africa. He's presently working on a book about the Uganda crisis, Christian witness, and the common good. He has written other books, The Church, God's Pilgrim People, The Church in the World, a historical ecclesiological study of the Church of Uganda with particular reference to post-independence Uganda. He holds a physics degree, a master's degree in theology from Wheaton, and a PhD in theology and mission history from Edinburgh University. More personally, I first heard him at a church, the Nairobi Chapel, years ago when he preached a provocative series on what it means to be a discerning Christian in the context of Africa's economic and political turmoil. At the time, Kenya was going through a political and constitutional crisis. And I feel that the thoughts that he offered were very useful guidance on the role of faith within such a context. And I went on to teach, more recently taught a course where he also was co-teaching with Regent University, Vancouver. And he has graciously agreed to speak to us today on the topic, A Time to Kill, Elections, State Legitimacy, and the Role of Religion in Uganda. Welcome.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much for the generous, very generous. When people have known you younger, you can get afraid of what they will say. And especially if some of your own individual stories have gotten into their circles. You know, younger people generally, I won't use the word gossip, they speak generously of older people. So I am grateful you didn't pull out any of those stories from the conversations. But thank you very much, Kiama. And thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation. And thank you very much, all of you, for gathering to reflect together on this particular subject. A lot has been said of what I am. It might help also to say what I am not. This is a subject for which you would expect political scientists to address. And I am not a political scientist. What else am I not? No, let's stop there. But A Time to Kill. Elections, state legitimacy, and the role of religion in Uganda. A Time to Kill. That notion, that idea comes from two quotations which I'll read now. The first by Yoweri Museveni, the current president of Uganda, which he did in 2008, and the other from the scriptures of the Christians, the Bible. I quote Yoweri Museveni, "It is me who hunted, and after killing the animal, they want me to go. Where should I go?" And now from the Ecclesiastes chapter 3, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build." So you can guess that I've picked this from A Time to Kill from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. What I'm going to do is I will introduce what it is that I would like to discuss with you, and then I'll get into the material using this motif, a time to kill, as a way to understand the story of Uganda. But I would be arguing that it's also to understand many similar states such as Uganda, and I'm really hoping for a deep conversation on this particular and in the way in which it gives us some insights on the general situation that we have both on the continent and even beyond. So there will be illustrations. The story is the story of Uganda, and I want to be as true to that story as I can, because I think it's to the extent that we are true to the particular that we have access to anything that we might call universal. On January the 16th, 2021, which is the end of an election cycle, the elections had just happened on the 2 days before, January the 14th. The Human Rights Watch, that international watchdog based here in this country, wrote, reporting on 21st of January, literally just barely a week after the announcement of President Museveni as the winner of that election. And I quote, "The weeks leading up to Uganda's recently concluded elections were characterized by widespread violence and human rights abuses. The abuses included killings by security forces, arrests and beatings of opposition supporters and journalists, disruption of opposition rallies, and a shutdown of the internet. Since the election campaign began in 2020, November, security forces have clamped down on opposition members and journalists, violently arresting scores of people, including the presidential candidates Patrick Amuriat of FDC and Robert Kyagulanyi of the National Unity Platform." I continue with the quote. "On November 18th, in Luka, Eastern Uganda, the police arrested and detained Kyagulanyi for allegedly breaching COVID-19 regulations. By mobilizing a large crowd, he was charged with doing an act likely to spread infection of disease and was released on bail 2 days later. Police responded to crowds of people protesting Kyagulanyi's detention with tear gas, beatings, and live bullets, leading to at least 54 deaths. Security Minister Eli Tumwine, who warned against any further protests, told the public that the police have the right to shoot and kill you. I quote. This was the third election cycle after Museveni's proverbial statement I just quoted about hunting and killing the animal. And you can see the consistency, this word killing. The common thread in all these previous elections, as reported by Human Rights Watch, abuses including killings by security forces, arrests, and beatings. For anyone to expect anything different from elections in Uganda would truly manifest either lack of appreciation or be feigning ignorance of the nature of the Ugandan state and Museveni's logic of its stewardship. And this is precisely part of the problem. Typical yardsticks of electoral legitimacy in Uganda and several other countries assume commitment to procedural standards, notably the United States, hitherto an erstwhile ally of Museveni, cancelled its observation of the 2021 election after most of its accreditation credentials requests were denied, and therefore concluding that the presidential vote would lack accountability and transparency, I quote. Earlier on in 2016, the U.S. mission had given another damning report especially because at the time social media sites had been shut down. And so the US mission did indicate that the delays in the voting materials, reports of pre-checked ballots, social media closures, excess use of police, collective, all undermined the integrity of the electoral process. The assumption is that the electoral process should work. In other words, these are mistakes of a system that is not working. But truth be told, this was in keeping with Museveni's reliance on what I call bullet politics, that is killing, as the primary means of retaining power, and the use of the ballot to legitimate it. I want to argue that killing has been the character of formal and informal processes of taking and retaining state power from the time of the colonial creation of the country and the state we now know as Uganda. I am utilizing the motif, a time to kill, drawn from the two quotes above, as a lens for coming to grips with the problem of elections and state legitimacy, and then ask the role of religion since its beginnings. I highlight in this conversation the collusion of religion with imperialism in the creating of the colonial, in bracket, killing state, and the sustenance of the same hitherto. I argue that the only hope for a future in making the most of this moment is to invoke the same, to note this as a time to kill the predatory state that is responsible for what I will later describe through a deliberate process of deconstruction, and that just as religion was central in building the foundations of killing and sustaining them, it also has a critical role in the deconstruction of the current state. However, for this to be, religion itself ought to engender a process of deconstruction. I am suggesting that Uganda's story is pivotal, not only because it's a prototype of neo-colonial states, but also under the current administration of President Museveni, who I can, using this metaphor, the killer who killed his animal that he had hunted. In the evening of his misrule and the dominant role he plays in the region, I am suggesting that the Uganda story is important for all of us. You might not know, but President Museveni has now been in power for 36 years and still counting. And still counting. He has promised us he's going nowhere. He holds the record as the 5th longest serving president in Africa and the longest in East Africa. I see my Kenyan colleagues here. The newly elected President Ruto reminded Kenyans that President Museveni is the father of East Africa. But President Museveni has also deployed, and I do not say Uganda has deployed. I'm very intentionally saying President Museveni has deployed because research has indicated that this is a policy of, and as you'll hear me, it is President Museveni, it's not a government that is in charge. He is the government. He has deployed troops on different missions in Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, South Sudan, Central Africa, and Equatorial Guinea. There was a promise in a tweet earlier this week by his son that there were prospects for a similar mission in Nairobi, but that was judged as a rude joke. But there we are. But it's simply saying that this thing about military missions is not a joke. Uganda takes it very seriously, and there is a history to that end. As I've already indicated, the biblical quotation, the time to kill, provides for me a cue of understanding, especially how religious actors and religion has legitimized the killing state and its killing regimes. I want to actually show that killing was not just by those fighting to capture and retain state power. There was much bloodshed, and bloodshed not in italics, real bloodshed in God's name, or legitimized to be in God's name, in keeping with the belief there is a time to kill. After all, the Bible says there is a time to kill. Religious actors were therefore part of the killing of this animal narrative and legitimizing regimes. First, a conversation on elections and state legitimacy, the Uganda story. The 2021 elections referenced above were the 10th in Uganda's history, the 6th during the leadership of Yoweri Museveni. In addition, the country has had 3 referenda, 2 of which were during the same Museveni era. Sadly, in spite of these elections and referenda, in fact, it is arguable to say that because of these elections and referenda, there is little to show in terms of socio-economic development. Uganda is ranked among the top 15 poorest countries in the world. There is little to show for political stability and very little to show for predictability in political transitions. Ironically, the only time there was a peaceful change of government in Uganda's history was from the colonial authority to the first independence government. That was the only time there was a sense of a peaceful transfer of power. Otherwise, the bullet rather than the ballot has been the defining force for capturing and retaining state power. I therefore want to speak about what I call the elections problem. Because you see, under Museveni, who has ruled for much longer, for beyond the entire period of our independence, 36 years out of 60. The significance of this, even as I speak about Uganda today, this very week we celebrate 60 years of independence, 36 of which have been under the stewardship of Yoweri Museveni. So it is significant even to be able to give this lecture at this moment, this reflection. Social scientists and historians have argued, and rightly so, that the roots of failure of successive governments in states like Uganda to conduct free and fair elections and to deliver sustainable peace, stability, and development are not just in the ineptness and the greed of political leadership or weak political institutions. The more critical underlying causal factors lie in the architecture of the state. The architecture of the state. And the way that lends itself to a kind of political leadership that seeks to control state machinery for its personal ends. Electoral processes are therefore part and parcel of the architecture designed to centralize political and economic power in one individual and his cronies. Why is religion important? One would have expected the Uganda story to be different, especially given how religious Uganda is. Close to 85% of the population of Uganda self-identify as Christians. Another round about 15% self-identify as Muslims. That leaves how many? just under 1% would say they don't believe at all, or they subscribe to other. It's a very religious country. It reminds me of Professor, our godfather in theology, John Beatty. Africans are notoriously religious. If there is any country notorious for its religiosity, it's certainly Uganda. But in spite of the predominance of religion in Uganda, in particular Christian, so it is fair to use the general description religion, because actually religion in Uganda, the dominance is Christianity, 85%. There will be some reference to Islam, the second major religious tradition, but the specific focus will be the religion of Christianity. I want to argue that religion and religious affiliation in Uganda have pandered to the neo-patrimonial character of the state and its political leadership. Religion and religious actors have pandered to the killing state and to killing processes. And what I seek to examine, among others, is to see how that state authority serves and how state authority is exercised, the means and the ends, and how these means and ends are all to do with killing. The question is, how has religion fostered the means and ends of this killing state? Legitimacy is about the belief that a rule, institution, or leader has the right to govern. The judgment about the rightfulness of a hierarchy between the rule or the ruler and its or their subjects, and about the subordination, the subordinate's obligation toward the rule of the ruler or the rule, as Hard has written in his book. In the public arena, the belief ought to be in collective, the belief ought to be collective across the majority of the constituent sections. Thus, legitimacy ought to produce distinctive collective effects in society, including collective socio-political order, a more efficient, more consensual, and perhaps more just governance systems. Therefore, the discourse on legitimacy demands interrogation on both the means and the ends and the means of statecraft. Elections and the subversion of the same are essentially in the category of means. Capturing and retaining of political power and the delivery of public goods and services, sustainable peace and stability are in the category of ends. What I am suggesting by the statement above, that it's critical, it helps us understand the way in which the Ugandan state works and how its leadership also has worked, killing the animal, a killing state. Otherwise sometimes called predatory states, which are states that kill predatory animals, are animals that eat up their children. That's really what you can say of states like Uganda. And I don't have to give you the statistics. The category I use, my readings around descriptors such as predator, killing states, is patrimonial, neo-patrimonial, which really has been very helpful for me to get an understanding of this. And especially the distinction that has been made more recently, which I think has been very helpful, because very often it's easy to confuse patronage systems with patrimonial systems as well as neo-patrimonial systems. And I think the three are different. And there has been many arguments going back and forth, but I won't get into it. But really, I buy into the idea that Uganda, as I have described the killing state that it is, and killing leaders, fits very well in the category of neo-patrimonial state and neo-patrimonial system. And the particularity about this, which is very helpful, is that neo-patrimonial systems take patrimonial and completely embed it in bureaucracies. So bureaucracies serve the patrimony. That's it. So it's really essentially a bureaucracy that totally is captured for patronage as well as the patrimonial, and therefore completely, as elsewhere it's described, an extractive state. I don't have time to enter into the argument around this being an African expression. I would like to argue, as I do in this paper, that actually the idea of extractive states was precisely what colonial states were meant to be. That neo-patrimonial states are an invasion of Africans, as some, and I don't need to make reference to some of the writing, and it's a lot, that relegate this to simply, it's the Africans who couldn't adjust to modern methods of running the state, especially European and, northern states. But the Africans, in readjusting to the patronage systems of chiefs and cultures and the patrimonial systems of centralized kingdoms, it's a logical conclusion of these quote-unquote primitive ways in comparison to modern states that run based on the rule of law, popular democracy, popular choice. My reading, my experience of the North has convinced me that neo-patrimonial states are exactly what the colonialists sought to create, extractive states. They were never intended to work for the people who inhabited these lands. They were completely and simply for extraction. In that sense, the patrimony was the colonial master. And I always am fascinated how Uganda had all the coffee and cotton fields, particularly cotton. They had divided Uganda into these agricultural zones, a particular zone producing a particular crop, cash crop, and cotton, which was the north and the east. And you know where the factory was for the cotton grown and planted in Uganda? There was a factory right in England, which was, it's completely extractive, and we can say more. The particular point, though, here is that in the constructing of this extractive state, Christianity wasn't just co-opted. No. Christianity was part and parcel of the architecture. Christianity, as other authors have indicated, Christian missions benefited from colonialism. Colonialism benefited from Christian missions. In fact, Christian missions were part and parcel of the colonial project. Mission by its nature is conquest. The concept mission by itself is conquest. So it's all very logical. The idea of hegemony, establishing hegemony, the idea of control. What may be different are the ends for killing. Extract for what? And it is clear that if you look at the history of religion on the continent, particularly the spreading of religions that came from the north, Christianity, and certainly from the Middle East, Islam, the particular motivation was how to grow and swell its numbers. And therefore, to be able to have a favorable government system, to be able to have a favorable ruler, it was necessary for the expansion of the particular religious tradition. Again, the argument that this is clearly within what was inherited, the principle was very well established in 1555, the Augsburg settlement, the Augsburg Declaration, which was the basis of the creation of modern European states. He who rules, his religion. So the idea, if you see in a lot of these countries, the idea was that you have rulers whose religion is the whole concept of establishment. And with that establishment, you secure control of the state. You also secure control of the minds. It's a process of managing socialization. And so this whole idea of creating of a predatory state and the sustainability of it, religion and religious actors had vested interests in order for that to happen. I argue that that was not simply the case in the founding of the state, it is also the case, it was also the case in the sustainability of these killing states. And the illustration I give is how elections worked. Elections in the transfer from the colonial to the, there were elections, I'm referencing two election cycles. The first cycle is the cycle of 1961, 1962, 1960, 61, 62, when there were elections that led to the independence government. And then the second election cycle that I reference was after the promulgation of the constitution, the reigning constitution in Uganda, promulgated under the leadership of Yoweri Museveni and his entire group. 1995, acclaimed as one of the best constitutions anywhere in the world. So what I really researched is how was the election cycle after what was prided to be an excellent constitution, an election that happened after that. So I reference these two to show how elections are essentially, they work to buttress, to strengthen, and to prolong the killing state, and therefore enable killing leaders to continue, although they are grouped to power. In fact, in places where they change, it's simply an exchange from one killing leader to the other. But it's essentially the same idea. I killed my animal, where do they want me to go? So if he passes, you must pass on the carcass to a trusted who will eat it well, and be able to pass it on to the others. And the point here really is to say that how then is religious actors engaged in a process like this? And since I am aware that in Kenya just concluded a very contested election with an announcement, I do hope that this might give some, how do elections work? And of course I am arguing is that to hope that elections within this architectural system will work to deliver for the common good is to not only misunderstand the nature of the state and how it works, it's also to misunderstand why the leaders exist. And it's also to misunderstand how religion actually works. Let me put it differently. The idea that religious leaders call for fasting and prayer for elections, the idea that therefore the fasting and the praying will deliver a result that works for the people, is first to imagine that that will deliver a result for justice, for the common good, for peace, for stability, for countries that can function, is a reflection of a misunderstanding of the nature of the predator state, the colonial state, the neo-colonial state. Two, the kind of leadership it produces who ascend to power. Three is to misunderstand how religion works, how Christianity works. It is to misunderstand how prayer and fasting of this nature works. My argument is that all of these work together to ensure killing happens. So to those elections of 1960 and 61. The background to those elections is that political parties had emerged in the 1950s. Not surprisingly, they were all aligned along religious affiliation. So there was one, the Democratic Party, the order, B, the UPC, Uganda People's Congress, and they were both, one definitely oriented towards its affiliation was Roman Catholic, and the other was Protestant, particularly within Protestantism in Uganda has primarily been defined by Anglicanism of the Ugandan type. And because these two competed for numbers historically, and I could go back to where it all began in the 1880s, even before Uganda was declared a protectorate 1888 to 1892, the wars in Uganda were religious wars. In fact, the first major war were Christians against Muslims, Muslims against Christians, and then when the Muslims were routed out of the palace of Buganda, the Christians, Catholic and Protestant fought, and it is the missionaries pleading with the colonial master, the governor, who support the Protestants, Anglicans, to beat the hell out of the Catholics. With the defeat of the Catholics, that is why the church in Uganda, Anglican, is called the Church of Uganda. So in a sense, it really became the established church. So fast forward, therefore, this rivalry is what defines what's going to happen towards independence. The configuration of the country in terms of populations, we can do ethnic, but I am thinking about the religious map of Uganda. So Catholic, Protestant, Catholics are more. The interesting thing is that once the Protestants took political power, they didn't invest in as much in proselytization, and I will not say conversion, because there were baptisms that happened in ways that I don't need to describe. So proselytization. So the Catholics succeeded in proselytizing more than the Anglicans. So consequently, because they recognized that their only power base would be in multiplying their converts, multiplying their adherents. And by the way, this is a story that you can replicate for Francophone countries where Catholic domination and so on. But they succeeded. So come towards independence, and there is a possibility of elections. You would therefore expect, because the Catholics had a larger number, that they would be the ones to win this election. And indeed, across the country, they did. But there is something else. The first contestation for power was in the Kingdom of Buganda. And the Kingdom of Buganda, the dominance wasn't so much Catholic, Protestant, it was the king. However, the Protestants had succeeded to bring about a conversion, I say proselytize, the king. And so the power base of the king of Buganda was Protestant. When there is a proposal by the colonialists to hold an election towards independence, the king of Buganda refuses. For how can you subject a people who already have a king? You can't do elections. That is to undermine the power of the king. So the Buganda refuses to participate in any electoral process in 1960. And so the elections happen outside Buganda, which, as you can guess, the DP, the Democratic Party, wins because it has the numbers. So the first prime minister, African prime minister, the senior minister, I think was called, is actually the leader of the Democratic Party. With this win, there was discomfort, because it would mean that now the leader of the independent country, Uganda, is going to be a Roman Catholic. Can the British allow this to happen? Can the Church of Uganda Protestant allow this to happen? The answer is no. So there is a revolt and there is a renegotiating. This renegotiating happens in London. The renegotiation succeeds in what way? Of course, the success is that now the idea is that there can't be an independence unless there is actual elections in Buganda. There must be truly an election. But Buganda, they say, no, you can't subject a people who already have their king. They already have their king and his officials. So it is agreed that the Lukiko will be a kind of an electoral college. So there is an electoral college that will actually select the people to represent Buganda in the independent parliament. You can therefore guess who now wins the entire election because it's repeated in 1961 prior to independence. When it is repeated, UPC, how did it win? Because the Kingdom of Buganda had a party, the king alone, Kabaka Yeka, which therefore voted because of the dominance of the Protestants in the Kingdom of Buganda, they therefore won. So who therefore won? Quote unquote, the Protestants, right? That's really what's happening. This contestation for who controls. Remember the Augsburg settlement, 1555? Who rules? The religion of the ruler. The religion of the ruler is the one that rules. So that's what is settled. And so that is how Milton Obote becomes the prime minister of independent Uganda. Is that sustainable? Of course it isn't. And the rest is history. Years later, we are not surprised that this country produces Idi Amin, who is very effective. He utilizes the killing machine. I was a student, so the stories I tell are not just a reading of history. It's lived experience. I can't forget, as a student in Ntare School, being there and my fellow young people, classmates, people in the same way playing together, they're being shipped, they're being ferried rather, by lorries to be sent back to their homes in northern Uganda because their fathers have been killed. En masse. I have argued in my other research that Idi Amin was a creature, not just of Uganda, but a creature of the way in which religion was embraced, foreign religion in Uganda. To put it more pointedly, I argue that Idi Amin was a creation of Christianity. Because when Idi Amin became president, as a Muslim, what does he do? Disestablish Christianity, particularly in its Protestant forms, and establish Islam. You will not be therefore surprised that at the ascendance of power of Idi Amin, Roman Catholic Buganda, that had suffered under the hand of Obote, were the first to celebrate the ascendance to power of Idi Amin. I could go on to show you how this killing machine, this killing motif has worked, in which religion is so totally embedded. I haven't had time to describe to you the responses of the Catholic leadership in protesting in the earlier period. The response of the Catholic leadership when Idi Amin, the pastoral letters passed about Idi Amin and what a blessing he was for Uganda, I could go on. All this process of killing. So these are elections that are supposed to usher in an independent Uganda, but they are elections that simply entrench this killing motif within both the state and the process of the country. Now to the elections. So when Idi Amin is president, he is overthrown very quickly. A combined force of Tanzanians and Ugandan rebels. I don't need to get into that story. 1979. Obote is back, he's president, 1980 to 85. 1980, there is an election that happens, Obote is elected. Again, we could discuss that election, but no need to. There is another story, and the role of religion in that election. Museveni at that point is one of those within the so-called government of liberation, the government that liberated Uganda from Idi Amin. And we actually believed it, that you can have a group of gunmen liberating you from another group of gunmen who believe in the gun and who inherit, instead of transforming the predator state, they inherit the same killing state with killing machines, with killing processes, and you will not be surprised that although President Museveni and his group argued that they are going to deconstruct the sectarian killing state by removing sectarianism, it's one of the major planks, no more sectarian. There's even a law against sectarianism. In other words, there's going to be a law around dividing society around ethnic or religious lines. But Museveni himself, in reviewing why he had to go to war, invokes the same, how it is DP that was cheated. In other words, it's the Roman Catholics that were cheated in that election. And the bulk, the strength of the Democratic Party was Buganda. And so those sentiments are arisen. In his bid to deconstruct the killing state, he argues for a new constitution. All very well. It's a conversation that our friends, our neighbors in Kenya have undertaken. Let's work on a constitution that establishes new rules, new relationships, power relations within the country. And indeed, a remarkable constitution. So the question is, the elections after this constitution, what happens? Now, when General Yoweri Museveni is in the bush fighting, he appeals to religious sentiments for generating support for his rebellion. And it is on record that the Catholic Church, particularly in Buganda, supported the rebellion. So it is not surprising that when General Yoweri Museveni and his group, Museveni, captures power, the Catholic Church issues a pastoral letter. The Catholic Church Archbishop speaks, and I quote, "Indeed, the Catholic Church supported Museveni and the NRM when they took power." Remember, the war was essentially between Museveni and Obote. We had suffered, this is the Catholic Church speaking, the Catholic Cardinal, Emmanuel Cardinal Wamala, writing, "We had suffered enough during Obote II regime." Who is the we? This is not Uganda. We, Uganda, had suffered. So this is whole definition of we. This us and them. Obote was imposed on Uganda. We knew Obote did not win the 1980 elections, but President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Kenneth Kaunda of Zanzibar brought Obote and imposed him on Uganda against the voice of the people. So you read this, imposed on Uganda against the voice of the people, right? The people. But this continued support of the Catholic Church to the Museveni regime continued unabated until at least 1998. And the occasion, and this is where now the electoral process begins, was an announcement by the regime to undertake a referendum. The 1995 Constitution directed a referendum to change political systems because so-called, there was now reigning 1995 to 2000, the NRM movement political system. So the question, the hope was now it was time to now establish a multi-party political system. The Catholic Church led the campaign against the referendum. How can you argue against space? The people do not need a referendum for them to choose their leaders and to choose where they organize themselves. Political parties are people's organizations on how they organize to compete for power. The Catholic Church says, how can you? This is a way for the NRM, for the movement, for Museveni, to extend his stay in power. Of course, the Catholic Church is aware that they have the numbers. That if a referendum goes against and the referendum says no opening up space, it will be an entrenchment of the movement system, in which case the Roman Catholic Church, Democratic Party, will not have the opportunity to. And actually, let it be said, all the other political parties as well said no to a referendum. Surprise, surprise. Church of Uganda leaders were for the referendum. Without saying so, the Church of Uganda leaders hoped that the movement system could be entrenched. And there is much to be said about what happened at the time. For both these groups now, the Catholic Church didn't succeed in its campaign against the referendum. The referendum actually happened. And the way in which that referendum happened and the role of the two churches in negotiating this is a very, very interesting story. The end of which was the referendum actually happened. Surprise! The referendum opened up space for multi-parties. But this worked certainly in the favor of President Museveni, because now it gave him the right to be able, and he uses the word, tubejeko. Let's get rid of those from the movement system who are not pro the progress of Uganda. In other words, let's get rid of them who are, so there's a redefinition of we, and the Catholic Church is incensed about this. And the Catholic Church proceeds with serious conversations, because this behavior by Museveni looks like a breach of a contract, an agreement. You know, we supported you that you might support us. So a meeting actually is called between, this is before the 2001 elections, which were the elections, the first elections under a multi-party system. A meeting actually happens in which the president invites the leadership, lay leadership, together with, led by the Cardinal Wamara, for a meeting to just be able to deal with, to deal with this polarization, Church of Uganda, Protestant, Roman Catholic Church, over the referendum, to deal with the concerns of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis Democratic Party and Buganda, and to be able to listen to them and answer the questions. What happens in that meeting is very, very interesting. A conversation that ensues, and the conclusions was that the Museveni promises, and I'm trying to look for the quote, and it is here. One of the people present, and I quote him, "It is the president who told us in that meeting, I want my successor to be a Muganda and a Catholic." We had gone to Rwachitura, this is him repeating, to listen. We wondered how he was planning to bring about this, his wish, given that the process, according to our constitution, for leadership succession would have to entail elections. But he had promised them, my successor will be a Muganda and a Catholic. To which he retorted, this is the president, "Leave it to me. I am going to engineer to ensure I am succeeded by a Muganda and a Catholic." My friend who reports this then said to me, it was my first time to hear the term engineer in referring to electoral processes. So elections are part of an engineering process for ensuring the animal killed is eaten by those who killed. When we came out of the meeting, one of us cautioned us that the leadership can never be given on a silver platter. It was my first time to hear the expression silver platter. The undertones are very strong. Processes were undertaken in which the religious bodies, it is Professor Gifford, who makes a distinction between NGO-wise religious actors and enchanted religious actors. I would like to argue that there is a third category in which religious institutions in their right as negotiators for power. Enchanted religion is relating to, it's a really deep conversation on how religious actors, how they organize in order to, and act in order to negotiate or seek power. It's very interesting how the religious institutional mechanisms are the ones that seem to take power in terms of the result that finally happens. Of course, as you can imagine, the elections did happen in 2001 under the new constitution. As expected, the now NRM that had become a party, of course, they won the elections, of course. And of course, they set up to rule the country based on these rules. I hope that these two illustrations show you how elections are part of the mechanism of killing. Secondly, how that is how the state works, extractive, and elections are part of that process of making it work this way. Professor Emmanuel Katongole has argued that we should never be surprised about the neo-colonial state as a planned state. That's what it was intended to do. I concur with him in this. But thirdly, it's that religious actors themselves are part and parcel of this killing machine. I am therefore suggesting that as we look forward, we need to aim at, in conclusion, the killing of this killing state, deconstruct. Very intentional processes. And these processes are going to have to be undertaken by the very creators. And as a man of the collar myself, I am arguing that on the table, religious actors must be. But part of that process would be the religious actors to acknowledge their role in the building, in the creating, building, and entrenching of this killing state. In other words, there needs to be a process of renunciation. But the process of renunciation is not in words. It must begin in the way in which the religious actors relate to one another. This whole idea of rivalry, and I guess I would argue, if I was making a case for ethnic rivalry and so on, the question of renunciation, the question of making certain choices on how to act together to deliver political outcomes that work together, a redefinition, a definite sense of engaging with the identity we. How do we construct a state that has we in our diversity, and in this instance, religious diversity? That will definitely need internal deconstruction of the religious actors themselves and their religious institutions. The enchantment, prayer, casting out demons, doing this and the other, if working within the same frame, will certainly produce the same result. In fact, I want to argue that the very enchanting processes of religion will be properly and fully integrated into the killing machinery. So people will be praying in State House, and the next day, the president will command troops to kill a certain region. And the people who prayed will then be invited to go and pray over the graves of those who have been killed. And what I discuss is not theoretical. It has happened in the country. Therefore, it is critical that the idea that religious actors, Christianity is the hope of our countries, is to misunderstand the nature of Christianity itself. That Christianity itself, as we know it, is part and parcel of the problem of our countries. We must deconstruct this kind of Christianity. We need to go back and ask. And that, I hope, for another time. Thank you very much.